Constantinople. Autumn 1520. A young man rides through the gates of one of the greatest cities of the early modern world and takes a throne his father has only just left behind. He is 25 years old. Across Europe, ambassadors write with quiet confidence, young, untested, probably manageable. They are wrong. His name is Suleiman. His own people will call him Kanuni, the Lawgiver. Europe will remember him as the Magnificent. He will rule for 46 years, lead armies toward Vienna, command the Mediterranean through admirals and alliances, and govern an empire stretching across 3 continents. He will build laws, mosques, hospitals, schools, and bridges meant to outlast him. He will love one woman with a devotion that broke many of the rules Ottoman dynastic custom had written for sultans. He will order the death of his closest friend. He will order the death of his most gifted son, and carry those decisions with him until the end. And at 71, sick and exhausted, he will die in a tent outside a Hungarian fortress, still on campaign, still refusing to become only a memory. But the story of how he became who he was, and what that becoming cost him, begins far from the throne. It begins on the Black Sea, in the provincial city of Trabzon, where a boy was trained to rule long before he was old enough to understand what ruling would demand of him. Settle in, let the noise of the modern world fall away. This is his story. Chapter 1. The world he was born into. Picture a morning in Trabzon, on the southeastern coast of the Black Sea, sometime in the early 1500s. The city is cold in the way that Black Sea cities are cold. A damp and persistent cold that comes off the water and settles into the stone of the buildings and the bones of the people who live in them. A boy is in a courtyard with his tutor, reciting Arabic vocabulary in the grey light before breakfast, his breath visible in the air, his posture, the deliberate posture of someone who has been told since he could understand words that how you hold yourself is itself a statement about who you are. He is perhaps 10 years old. He is the son of a prince. He will one day be the sultan of one of the most powerful empires of his age. He does not know this yet with certainty. No Ottoman prince knew it with certainty, because the Ottoman system of succession did not allow certainty. What he knows is that he is being prepared, relentlessly and completely, for something that will require everything he has. His name is Suleiman. The Ottoman Empire in the early 16th century was not simply a large state with a powerful army. It was a civilization, a system, a way of organizing human life that had been developing for 2 centuries by the time Suleiman was born, and that had produced, in those 2 centuries, a machinery of power so sophisticated and so carefully designed that it functioned almost like a living organism, growing and adapting and consuming what it needed and discarding what it did not. The empire had begun as a small Turkish principality in northwestern Anatolia in the late 1300s, founded by a warrior chief named Osman, whose name would eventually give the empire its title. In a little over a century, his descendants had transformed that small principality into a state that stretched across 3 continents. They had conquered Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire that had stood for more than 1,000 years, and they had made that conquered city their capital, rebuilding it in their own image, By the time Suleiman's father Selim inherited the throne in 1512, the Ottoman Empire controlled Anatolia, the Balkans, and significant portions of the Middle East and North Africa. Its army was among the most professional fighting forces in the world. Its navy was learning, rapidly and systematically, how to become something similar at sea. And at the centre of all of it, in the great palace complex the Ottomans called Topkapi, sat the Sultan. The office of Sultan in the Ottoman system was unlike the kingship of European monarchs in ways that Europeans consistently misunderstood. European kings were powerful but constrained, bounded by the expectations of the nobility, by the traditions of the church, by the accumulated web of rights and obligations that medieval civilization had built up over centuries. They were the first among a class of powerful men who had their own claims and their own resources, and who could, under sufficient provocation, push back. The Ottoman Sultan was something different. He was not the first among equals. He was, in the theory and largely in the practice of the system, the sole source of all legitimate authority in the empire. Every office, every title, every piece of land held by anyone in the empire was held at the Sultan's pleasure and could be withdrawn at any moment. The Grand Viziers who served as his chief ministers, the generals who commanded his armies, the governors who administered his provinces, all of them existed at his sufferance, and all of them knew it. This was not theoretical. It was enforced, regularly and visibly, through execution. Ottoman sultans executed high officials with a regularity that European observers found alarming, because in European political culture, a king who executed too many powerful men was a king who was losing control. In the Ottoman system, execution was the system working as designed. It was the Sultan demonstrating that no one, regardless of their power or their years of loyalty, stood beyond his reach. Into this world, in the year 1494, Suleiman was born to Selim and his consort Hafsa Sultan in Trabzon on the Black Sea coast. The name Suleiman was the Arabic form of Solomon, the biblical king whom Islamic scholarship regarded as a prophet, a lawgiver, a man of extraordinary wisdom who had ruled justly over an empire given to him by God. The name was not chosen casually. Nothing in the Ottoman system was chosen casually. Trabzon was not Constantinople. It was a provincial city, important for its position on the Black Sea trade routes, but far from the centre of power, and that distance was deliberate. Ottoman princes were sent to the provinces as governors from an early age, because governing a province was how you learned to govern, and because keeping them at a distance from the capital reduced the possibilities for conspiracy. The Ottoman Empire had no fixed rule of primogeniture. The throne did not automatically pass to the eldest son. It passed to whichever son was strong enough to take it, and the process by which that determination was made was often violent. When a sultan died, his sons competed for the throne, and the son who won was expected, by tradition and by the brutal logic of the system, to eliminate his brothers, not because of personal cruelty, but because living brothers were potential centres of rebellion, potential figureheads for factions that would inevitably form around them. The historian Leslie Peirce, in her foundational study of the Ottoman imperial household, published in 1993, describes this system as one of the central organising facts of Ottoman political life. Every prince grew up knowing that his brothers were his rivals, that his father might move against him if he seemed too ambitious, and that if he succeeded to the throne, he would face the most consequential decisions of his life within his first days of rule. It was a system designed to produce strong rulers by subjecting them to the most extreme selection pressure imaginable. It was also a system that shaped the psychology of every person inside it in ways that left permanent marks. Suleiman grew up in Trabzon with his mother, Hafsa Sultan, traditionally identified in Ottoman sources as being of Crimean origin. A woman who was educated and politically astute, and who devoted herself to her son's preparation with the focused intensity of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Ottoman mothers of princes were not passive figures. They were active participants in their sons' political education, because their own survival and their own position depended entirely on their son's success. Hafsa Sultan would remain close to Suleiman throughout his early reign, serving as a moderating influence in the court, a person whose counsel he genuinely sought. Her death in 1534 would affect him in ways that those around him observed and recorded. But in the years in Trabzon, she was simply his mother, the most constant presence in a childhood defined by preparation. The education of an Ottoman prince in the early 16th century was one of the most comprehensive programs of development that any civilization had yet designed for its future rulers. A prince was expected to be a military commander capable of leading armies in the field, a legal and administrative authority capable of making binding decisions, a diplomat capable of reading the intentions of foreign powers, and a poet, because in Ottoman court culture, the ability to compose verse was considered a mark of cultivation that distinguished a ruler from a mere conqueror, and he was expected to be a craftsman. This last requirement surprises people who encounter it for the first time. Ottoman sultans were trained in a manual craft, typically metalworking or goldsmithing, and they practiced it throughout their lives. Suleiman became an accomplished goldsmith. The discipline of working with his hands, of producing something precise and beautiful through skill and patience, was considered part of the formation of character that a sultan required. It was a reminder, built into the daily routine, that mastery required practice and that patience was not weakness but a form of strength. He wrote poetry throughout his life, under the pen name Muhibi, which means the affectionate one. More than 3,000 of his poems survive. Scholars of Ottoman literature treat them as serious artistic achievements. Poetry that engages genuinely with questions of love and loss and mortality that occupied him from his youth until his final campaigns. He was also trained in horsemanship and archery, and the physical disciplines of warfare from early childhood. The Ottoman military tradition placed a high value on the Sultan's personal presence in battle, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a practical reality. A sultan who commanded from the rear was a sultan whose army did not fully trust him. Suleiman would spend the rest of his life honouring that expectation. While Suleiman was growing up in Trabzon, the world around him was changing at a speed that no one alive had experienced before. His father Selim was remaking the empire with a ferocity and a strategic vision that remains remarkable across 5 centuries. In 15, 16, and 1517, Selim conquered the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria in barely 2 years, bringing under Ottoman control the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, the 2 most sacred sites in the Islamic world. The acquisition of the holy cities changed the nature of the Ottoman Sultanate in a way that would shape everything that followed. The Ottomans had always been Muslim rulers, but now they were the guardians of Islam's most sacred places, the protectors of the pilgrimage routes, the defenders of the faith in a way that was concrete and geographic rather than merely claimed. The empire was no longer just a powerful state. It was the centre of a civilization. When Selim died in September of 1520, after 8 years on the throne, he left his son one of the most powerful empires in the world, an army that was battle-hardened and exceptionally organized, and a set of expectations that would have crushed anyone who was not prepared to meet them. Suleiman had been preparing for this his entire life. He rode to Constantinople and took the throne. The ambassadors of Europe filed their reports. The world did not yet know what was coming. Chapter 2. The Education of a Prince. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to princes. It is not the loneliness of poverty or isolation. It is the loneliness of a person who is surrounded at all times by people who are performing rather than present, who are calculating rather than simply being there, who are always aware, in every interaction, of what you will one day become and what proximity to that future might be worth to them. Suleiman grew up inside that loneliness. He learned to read it early, to distinguish the performance of loyalty from its substance, the appearance of friendship from the genuine article. He developed, as people who grow up in that kind of environment often do, an acute sensitivity to the difference between someone who was truly interested in him and someone who was interested in what he represented. He found what he was looking for in a boy named Ibrahim. They had met when Suleiman was still a young prince in the provinces, sometime around 1510. When Ibrahim was a boy of roughly the same age, working in the household of a provincial official, the exact circumstances of how they came to know each other are recorded differently in different sources. And the historian, Caroline Finkel, in her comprehensive history of the Ottoman Empire published in 2005, notes that the early details of Ibrahim's background are difficult to verify with full precision. What is clear is that Ibrahim was most likely of Greek or Albanian origin, probably from the coastal region of the Western Balkans, and that he entered Suleiman's household as a page at some point in the second decade of the 16th century. What happened between them in those early years was unusual by any standard. Ottoman princes had pages and servants and companions assigned to them as a matter of course. The palace system was built around a hierarchy of personal service that was also a hierarchy of political proximity, and young men who served princes well could expect to rise with them when those princes became sultans. It was a rational system of patronage, and it produced real loyalty. But it was loyalty of a particular transactional kind. The loyalty of men who understood that their fortunes were tied to someone else's. What Suleiman and Ibrahim developed was something different. It was, by all available evidence, a genuine friendship of the kind that is rare in any life and almost impossible in the life of a prince. Ibrahim was intelligent, charming, and possessed of the kind of quick mind that Suleiman, himself deeply educated and deeply interested in ideas, found genuinely engaging. He played musical instruments with considerable skill. He spoke multiple languages. He had opinions and was willing to express them, which in the Ottoman court required a particular kind of courage. Suleiman valued it. More than valued it, he seemed to need it. Ibrahim was someone Suleiman could talk to without performing, and in a life that required constant performance. That was not a small thing. He brought Ibrahim with him to Constantinople when he became Sultan, and gave him increasingly significant positions in the palace hierarchy, moving him upward through the ranks with a speed that older officials observed with discomfort. Ibrahim became the Sultan's personal page, then his keeper of the royal bedchamber, then a figure of such proximity to the Sultan that foreign ambassadors began to seek him out as the most reliable channel of communication with the Ottoman throne. The friendship existed inside a world that was itself a kind of education, because the Ottoman court in the early 16th century was one of the most concentrated environments of learning and political intelligence that existed anywhere. Topkapi Palace was not a single building. It was a complex of buildings arranged around a series of courtyards, each one more private than the last, each one marking a step deeper into the hierarchy of proximity to the Sultan. The outermost courtyard was essentially public, open to the business of the empire. The second courtyard was administrative, where the imperial council met and the machinery of government operated. The third courtyard was the Sultan's private domain, where the palace school trained the young men who would become the next generation of Ottoman officials. The palace school, called the Enderun, was one of the most remarkable educational institutions of the 16th century, and almost no one in the modern world has heard of it. It was the final destination of the Devshirme system, the practice by which the Ottoman state periodically recruited young boys from the Christian communities of the Balkans and Anatolia, converted them to Islam, and educated them for state service. The boys selected were chosen for intelligence and physical potential, removed from their families, given an Ottoman education, and groomed for careers in either the military or the civil administration. The most talented of them ended up in the palace school, where they received an education that was arguably among the finest available anywhere in the world at that time. The Enderun trained its students in Islamic theology and law, in Arabic and Persian literature, in mathematics and astronomy, in music, in horsemanship and military drill, and in the specific art of Ottoman court protocol, which was itself a complex discipline requiring years of study. The graduates of the Enderun became the senior officials of the empire, the grand viziers and military commanders and provincial governors who made the Ottoman system function. Ibrahim was a product of this world, or of something very like it. His intelligence had been recognized. He had been educated. And he had found his way into proximity with the future Sultan at exactly the moment when that proximity would matter most. What Suleiman understood, watching the Enderun operate from the inside, was its central limitation. The system produced loyalty, but it was a specific kind of loyalty. Loyalty to the institution of the Sultanate rather than to any particular Sultan. A man who had been given everything by the Ottoman system was a man whose entire identity was Ottoman, which meant he would serve whoever sat on the throne with the same dedication he would have given a different sultan. It was structural loyalty, not personal loyalty. Ibrahim was the exception. His loyalty was personal. It was loyalty to Suleiman the man, not Suleiman the Sultan, and that distinction was, in the Ottoman context, extraordinary. Suleiman's own education had continued through his years as a provincial governor. He had governed the province of Kaffa on the Crimean coast. starting around 1510, and then the important province of Manisa in western Anatolia, which was considered the most significant provincial posting for an Ottoman heir, apparent because of its proximity to Constantinople and its complexity as an administrative unit. Governing Manisa taught Suleiman things that no formal curriculum could provide. He learned how the tax system actually worked at the point where it met actual people, which was different from how it worked in the theoretical descriptions he had studied. He learned how disputes between communities were resolved when there was no clear legal precedent. He learned how to manage officials who were competent but difficult, and officials who were pleasant but incompetent, and the specific challenge of determining which category someone fell into before their failures became consequential. He learned, in other words, that governance was not the application of principles to problems. It was the management of human beings in all their inconsistency and self-interest and occasional remarkable dedication, and that the principles existed to provide a framework within which that management could happen, not to replace the judgment that the management required. This was the lesson that would eventually make him not just a great conqueror, but a great builder, which required something different and in many ways more difficult. His time in Manisa also gave him a sense of the empire's population as actual people rather than administrative categories, and this sense would inform the legal reforms that became one of the defining achievements of his reign. The Ottoman legal system in the early 16th century operated simultaneously on two tracks that were theoretically complementary but practically in constant tension. One track was the Sharia, the Islamic religious law administered by judges called Qadis. The other track was the Kanun, the secular law promulgated by the Sultan through his own legislative authority, covering areas that Sharia did not address directly and varying from region to region in ways that created confusion and inconsistency across the empire. Suleiman devoted enormous energy throughout his reign to rationalizing the Kanun, producing a comprehensive legal code that applied consistently across the empire. The historian Halil Inalcik, whose work on the Ottoman Empire is considered foundational by scholars in the field, describes Suleiman's legal reforms as among the most sophisticated legislative achievements of the 16th century. His own people did not call him the Magnificent. They called him Kanuni, the Lawgiver. That title, the one his own subjects chose for him, tells you something important about how he understood his own reign that the European name obscures. The Europeans saw the armies and the conquests and the expansion of Ottoman power into territories they had considered safely Christian. They gave him a name that reflected their experience of him. His own people saw the courts and the legal codes and the systematic attempt to make the machinery of governance serve the people it governed. They gave him a name that reflected their experience of him. Both titles were accurate. Both were incomplete. The full picture requires holding them together. Ibrahim moved through all of this at Suleiman's side, becoming the translator in diplomatic meetings with European ambassadors, the conduit through which Suleiman communicated decisions that required a particular kind of delivery, the extension of Suleiman's will into the world. And as the years passed and his proximity to the Sultan deepened, something began to shift in Ibrahim that the early friendship had not contained. The power that came with proximity began to feel. To Ibrahim, like his own power rather than borrowed power, the confidence that had made him a valuable companion began to express itself in ways that created enemies in the court and that eventually required Suleiman to make a decision no friendship had prepared him for. But that decision was still years away. In the early 1520s, as Suleiman prepared to launch the campaigns that would define the first decade of his reign, Ibrahim was simply his closest friend, his most trusted advisor, and the person who understood him best. The empire was ready. The Sultan was ready. Europe had not yet understood what that meant. Chapter 3. The Father Who Shaped Everything. Begin with a road in the autumn of 1520. Somewhere between the provincial city of Manisa and the capital, Suleiman is riding toward Constantinople to claim the throne his father has just vacated by dying. He is 25 years old. The road is long enough that he has time to think about the man he is going to replace, the man who shaped him, the man whose shadow he will spend the next 46 years either following or escaping, or, in the most honest moments of self-examination that a sultan allows himself, trying to synthesize into something that is neither imitation nor rejection, but something harder and more genuinely his own. Selim the First, his father. To understand Suleiman, you have to understand Selim. And to understand Selim, you have to be willing to sit with a kind of greatness that is genuinely uncomfortable. The greatness of a man who achieved things that have rarely been achieved in human history, and who achieved them through methods that leave very little room for easy admiration of the person as distinct from the results. Selim became Sultan in 1512 under circumstances that set the tone for everything that followed. His father Bayezid II was still alive. Bayezid had been Sultan for 30 years, a long reign by Ottoman standards, and he had governed in a style that his contemporaries described as measured and his enemies described as weak. He was a man of genuine cultural refinement, interested in poetry and philosophy, cautious in military matters, and increasingly consumed in his final years by the demands of managing a succession struggle that Ottoman dynastic logic made inevitable. He had 3 sons, Ahmed, Korkut, and Selim. Ahmed was the eldest, and positioned as the heir apparent. Korkut was a scholar and a mystic, genuinely more interested in religious and philosophical questions than in the throne, though he understood that in the Ottoman system, a prince who did not compete for the throne was still a potential threat to whoever won it. Selim was the youngest, stationed far from the centre of power and deeply aware of that distance. Selim decided not to wait. In 1511 he marched his forces toward Constantinople in a direct challenge to his father's authority. Bayezid sent an army to stop him. Selim was defeated and retreated. A different man might have accepted this as a signal that he had overreached. Selim tried again. This time the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps that formed the backbone of the Ottoman military, shifted their support to him, and with the Janissaries behind him, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Bayezid abdicated. He died a few weeks later on the road to the provincial city where he had planned to retire. The historian Caroline Finkel notes that the exact circumstances of Bayezid's death are recorded differently in different sources, and that contemporaries drew their own conclusions about what a convenient death at such a convenient moment might mean. It was the kind of ambiguity that Ottoman succession history produced regularly, and that everyone in the court understood without needing to discuss directly. Selim then proceeded to eliminate his brothers. Ahmed was defeated in battle and executed. Korkut, according to the primary Ottoman chronicles, was caught attempting to flee and put to death. The process was systematic and complete. When it was finished, Selim was the only male of the dynasty still alive above the age of childhood, with the exception of Suleiman. Suleiman grew up knowing the full weight of what Ottoman succession required. He knew how his grandfather had died. He knew what had happened to his uncles. He understood from childhood, not as an abstraction, but as a concrete family history, that the Ottoman system was a machinery of survival, and that navigating it required a combination of capability and fortune that no amount of preparation could fully guarantee. This knowledge did not make him brutal. It made him careful. There is an important distinction between those two things, and Suleiman understood it better than almost any ruler of his era. Selim's actual reign, the 8 years between 1512 and 1520, represents one of the most concentrated periods of military achievement in the history of the period. In 1514, he defeated Shah Ismail of the Safavid Persian Empire at the Battle of Chaldiran, a victory that demonstrated the decisive military advantage that Ottoman firearms technology gave their armies over opponents who had not yet made the same technological investments. The Janissaries advanced behind a line of artillery that broke the Safavid cavalry charge before it could close to the range where it would have been effective. The battle was decided before the two forces had fully engaged. Then Selim turned south. In 1516 and 1517, in barely 18 months, he destroyed the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria, one of the most powerful states in the Islamic world. The Mamluks had ruled Egypt for more than 2.5 centuries. They had defeated the Mongols when no other Islamic state could. They were experienced, proud, and convinced of their own military competence. They were also using tactics and equipment that had not significantly evolved in a generation, and against the Ottoman combination of artillery and disciplined infantry, those tactics were simply insufficient. Selim entered Cairo as its conqueror. He took control of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and the Ottoman claim to the leadership of the Sunni Islamic world was established in a way that would shape the empire's identity for centuries. The historian Giancarlo Casale, in work published in the 2010s, notes that the precise nature and timing of how this religious authority was formalized is still debated among scholars. But the symbolic and political weight of controlling the holy cities was not in doubt. Suleiman inherited all of this. He inherited the territories Selim had conquered. He inherited the military machine Selim had built and tested. He inherited the prestige of the holy cities and the responsibility they carried. He inherited the weight of comparison. Selim had transformed the empire in 8 years. He had defeated 2 major powers in succession. He was, by any reasonable historical measure, one of the most consequential rulers the Ottoman Empire had ever produced. Suleiman was his son. The expectation that came with that inheritance was present in every interaction, in the way senior officials assessed the new sultan in those first weeks, in the way the Janissaries watched him during the early military reviews, in the way foreign ambassadors framed their dispatches home. Could he match his father? Suleiman understood the question. He had spent his entire life preparing to answer it. What the court did not yet know was that he was not going to simply repeat his father's achievements. He was going to build something different, something that was in some ways more ambitious than what Selim had created. Because Selim had been a conqueror and Suleiman intended to be a civilization, the campaigns would come, and they would be as consequential as anything Selim had done. But they would be in service of something larger than the campaigns themselves, and that larger purpose was what would eventually distinguish Suleiman in the judgment of history, and in his own judgment, which was the one that mattered most to him. He sat on the throne of one of the most powerful empires on earth. He was 25 years old. He looked west. Europe was waiting, and Europe did not know it yet. Chapter 4. The First Campaigns Europe Learns to be Afraid. The morning of August 29th, 1521, begins like any other morning in Belgrade. The garrison is at its posts. The city's population is going about the particular business of people who have been under siege for 3 weeks and who have learned to organize their fear into routines that feel almost normal. The walls have held. The walls have always held. Belgrade has been the key to Central Europe for decades. The fortress that stopped Mehmed II. Suleiman's great-grandfather, in 1456. The city has absorbed Ottoman pressure before. By the end of this day, it will be over. Belgrade fell on August 29th, 1521. Less than a year after Suleiman took the throne. The speed of the operation was not simply a matter of superior numbers. The historian Gábor Ágoston, whose scholarship on Ottoman military organization has shaped how the field understands the period, emphasizes that Ottoman success reflected a combination of organizational sophistication, artillery superiority, and a command structure that could translate a sultan's decision into coordinated action across a large force with a speed and precision that contemporary European armies could not consistently match. Belgrade's fortifications had been designed for an earlier era of warfare. They could not absorb what was brought against them. The reaction in Europe was something between alarm and disbelief. The courts of Hungary and Austria and the Holy Roman Empire had been aware, in a general way, that the new Ottoman Sultan existed and that he was conducting military operations. But the assumption, which the early diplomatic reports had done nothing to correct, was that a young and untested sultan would spend the early years of his reign consolidating what his father had left him. This was what young rulers did. They established themselves, managed the court factions that any succession created, demonstrated their authority through domestic politics before testing it in war. Suleiman had not done that. He had waited less than a year after taking the throne before launching his first major campaign, and he had chosen Belgrade, the most symbolically significant target on the European frontier, as his first objective. The message was not subtle, and the courts of Europe received it without difficulty. This sultan was not going to wait. In 1522, less than a year after Belgrade, he launched his second major campaign, this time against the island of Rhodes in the eastern Mediterranean. Rhodes was the headquarters of the Knights of St. John, a military religious order that had been established during the Crusades, and that had made the island one of the most heavily fortified positions in the Mediterranean. The Knights controlled the sea lanes around Rhodes, with a fleet that regularly interfered with Ottoman shipping and the pilgrimage routes between the Ottoman mainland and Egypt. They had resisted an Ottoman siege in 1480. They had been a persistent challenge to Ottoman presence in the eastern Mediterranean for decades. The siege lasted 5 months. The Knights, under their Grand Master Philippe Villiers de l'Isle al-Adam, fought with a tenacity that impressed even the Ottoman commanders. The fortifications had been continuously upgraded in the decades since the last Ottoman attempt. incorporating the most advanced military engineering of the era, and they absorbed the bombardment with a resilience that cost the attacking forces significant casualties. But the outcome was not in doubt. The defenders were outnumbered, their walls crumbling under sustained bombardment, and no relief force was coming from Europe. By December of 1522, the Grand Master sent envoys to negotiate terms. What happened in those negotiations revealed something about Suleiman that the military record alone does not capture. He offered the knights generous terms. They could surrender the island, leave with their weapons and their possessions and their people, and go wherever they chose. There would be no massacre, no enslavement, no punitive treatment of the civilian population. He treated the Grand Master with the formal respect due to a defeated but honourable opponent. Contemporary observers on the European side noted the generosity of the terms with something close to bewilderment. A sultan who had just overwhelmed one of the most powerful fortresses in the Mediterranean could have demanded unconditional surrender. He had not done that. The decision reflected something in Suleiman's character that appears consistently across his reign, a quality of deliberateness, of thinking beyond the immediate military objective to the political reality that the military objective was supposed to produce. He was not simply conquering, he was building, and building requires more than the ability to take things. It requires the ability to manage what comes after. The knights evacuated Rhodes in January of 1523 and eventually settled on the island of Malta, where they would remain for the next 2.5 centuries. In 1523, Suleiman appointed Ibrahim as Grand Vizier, the highest office in the Ottoman state after the Sultan himself. The appointment shocked the court. Ibrahim was young, of foreign origin, with no military record that justified the position, elevated entirely through his personal relationship with the Sultan. Senior officials who had spent decades working their way through the Ottoman system watched a man in his mid-20s step over all of them to the highest administrative office in the empire. Ibrahim proved, in the years that followed, to be a genuinely capable administrator and brilliant diplomat. The Venetian ambassadors, whose reports on the Ottoman court are among the most detailed surviving records of the period, described him with consistent admiration for his ability to navigate complex diplomatic situations. He was also, as it became apparent over time, acquiring enemies at a rate that his proximity to the Sultan was temporarily protecting him from. In 1526, Suleiman marched north with one of the largest armies the empire had put in the field in a generation. He was going to Hungary. The Battle of Mohacs took place on August 29th, 1526, exactly 5 years to the day after the fall of Belgrade. The coincidence was not accidental. Suleiman understood the power of symbolic timing, and choosing the anniversary of his first great victory for his most ambitious campaign was the kind of deliberate statement that a ruler who thought carefully about how power was communicated would make. The Hungarian army that faced him commanded somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 men. According to the estimates most commonly cited by historians of the period, the Hungarian nobility had, in the months before the battle, finally overcome enough of its internal divisions to assemble a unified force. It was not enough. The battle lasted approximately 2 hours. The Ottoman artillery opened the engagement with a bombardment that broke the Hungarian cavalry charges before they could close with the Janissary infantry. The Hungarian forces, fighting in the traditional European style that had been effective against other European opponents, found themselves unable to adapt to the Ottoman combination of firepower and disciplined infantry in the time available to them. King Louis II of Hungary fled the battlefield and drowned, crossing a swollen stream in his heavy armour. The Hungarian army ceased to exist as a fighting force. The historian John Freely, in his biography of Suleiman, published in 2009, describes Mohacs as one of the most consequential battles of the 16th century, not simply because of the military result, but because of its political aftermath. The Kingdom of Hungary lost its king, its army, and its effective independence in a single afternoon. Suleiman entered the Hungarian capital of Buda 2 weeks after the battle. He ordered that the city not be looted, an instruction that reflected the same calculation he had applied at Rhodes. He was not simply conquering Hungary, he was deciding what Hungary was going to be in relation to the Ottoman Empire. He withdrew from Buda after 2 weeks. The decision to withdraw rather than garrison the city permanently was a deliberate strategic choice. He had achieved his immediate objectives, demonstrated the consequences of resistance, and left the political situation in Central Europe in the fluid state that gave him the most options for the future. He was already planning the next campaign. In 1529, he marched to Vienna. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V was not in Vienna when Suleiman arrived. He was in Italy, managing a crisis that illustrated with painful clarity how thoroughly the European powers were distracted by their own conflicts. The defence of Vienna fell to a garrison under the command of Niklas Graf Salm, a veteran military commander who prepared the city with everything available to him. The Ottoman army arrived in late September of 1529 and immediately encountered problems the campaign planners had not fully accounted for. The summer had been exceptionally wet across Central Europe, and the heavy artillery that had been so decisive at previous sieges had been left behind because it was impossible to move through the mud in time to matter. The Ottomans arrived at Vienna with a reduced artillery train, insufficient to create the breaches their standard siege tactics required. The second problem was time. The Central European winter was coming, and an army of that size could not be sustained in the field through the season without adequate supply lines. Suleiman had perhaps 3 weeks to take Vienna, or accept that the campaign had reached its limit. The garrison resisted each assault with the focused determination of men who understood what defeat meant. On October 14th, 1529, Suleiman ordered the withdrawal. Vienna had not fallen. The relief in Europe was immediate and intense. Habsburg accounts constructed a narrative in which Vienna's survival reflected something greater than military fortune. Suleiman's own account, recorded in his personal diary, notes the weather, the supply situation, and the lateness of the season as the reasons for the decision. He retreated in good order, his army intact, his strategic position fundamentally unchanged. He had not taken Vienna. He had not been decisively defeated either. The scholar, Andrew Wheatcroft, in his study of the Habsburg-Ottoman conflict, published in 2008, argues that the logistical constraints on the Vienna campaign were real, and that Suleiman was operating at the sustainable limit of Ottoman campaign logistics at that distance from Constantinople, a judgment that the subsequent history tends to support. He would campaign toward Vienna again in 1532, marching a large army before being slowed by the unexpected resistance of a small fortress called Gunz. whose commander Nikola Jurisic held off the Ottoman advance for 3 critical weeks with a garrison of several hundred men. A delay that again made reaching Vienna impossible before the weather closed in. He never reached Vienna again, but the campaigns of 1521 through 1532 had established something in the European imagination that would not easily fade. A permanent awareness that the Ottoman Empire was not a distant power that could be managed through occasional diplomacy, but a challenge that reshaped how an entire continent thought about its own security. Europe had been forced to take measure of itself in ways it had not been forced to before. The question was, what it would do with that reckoning. Chapter 5. The Machine That Changed a Continent. There is a scene that several contemporary sources describe, in different versions, from the period of the Vienna campaigns. A Habsburg envoy is escorted through the outer reaches of the Ottoman camp toward the Sultan's tent to deliver a message. It is early morning. The camp stretches in every direction as far as he can see, organized with a precision that he does not have a frame of reference for, because no European army of the era was organized this way. There are supply depots laid out with geometric regularity. There are cooking fires arranged in rows. There are horses tended by men performing specific assigned tasks rather than milling about in the way that European camp followers milled about. There are medical tents. There are blacksmith operations. There are prayer spaces marked out in the dust. He is not walking through an army. He is walking through a state that has decided to go somewhere. He delivers his message. He is escorted back out. He writes his report to the Habsburg court. The report, by the accounts of those who read it, is deeply unsettling. To understand why Europe was afraid of Suleiman's armies, you have to understand what it was actually facing, because the fear was not irrational. It was a precise response to a precisely understood reality, and that reality was unlike anything the European military experience of the period had prepared it for. The Ottoman army that Suleiman led into Central Europe was not simply a large army. It was a system, a carefully designed and continuously refined instrument of organized force that had been developing for more than a century. Its core was the Janissaries, the infantry force created by the Ottoman sultans in the 14th century as a counterweight to the unreliable cavalry forces that had made earlier Ottoman armies dependent on the loyalty of Turkish tribal leaders. They were recruited through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, given a lifetime of military training, paid regularly from the imperial treasury, and housed in barracks in Constantinople and the major cities of the empire. They were professional soldiers in an era when professional soldiers were genuinely rare, and the professionalism showed in everything they did. They drilled constantly. They maintained their weapons with systematic care that European observers noted with frank admiration. They followed orders through the chaos of battle with a discipline that contemporary European infantry could not consistently match. And they were equipped with firearms that they used with a practiced efficiency that came from years of training rather than battlefield improvisation. Behind the Janissaries were the Ottoman cavalry, the Sipahis, who held land grants from the Sultan in exchange for military service. They were men with their own resources and their own sense of honour, and they fought with the confidence of people who had been riding and fighting since childhood. And behind both the infantry and the cavalry was the artillery. The Ottoman artillery in this period was among the most powerful in the world, not simply in terms of the size of the guns, though the Ottomans had guns of extraordinary size, but in terms of the organizational capacity to move them, supply them, and integrate them into a combined arms system that could break fortifications that previous armies could not breach. This is what had taken Belgrade in 3 weeks. This is what had ended the Hungarian army at Mohacs in 2 hours. The logistics that supported this army were themselves a remarkable achievement. An Ottoman campaign army required food, vata, fodder for the horses and camels, ammunition, medical supplies, replacement equipment, and the administrative capacity to distribute all of these things across an army strung out over hundreds of miles of road. The Ottomans had developed, over decades of campaigning, a supply system built around a network of supply depots, a corps of trained logisticians, and a discipline about campaign timing that kept the army moving when it needed to move and stationary when the supply situation required it. The Habsburg ambassador Ogier Giselin de Busbecq, whose letters from Constantinople in the 1540s and 1550s are among the most valuable eyewitness accounts of the period, described the Ottoman military with the frank admiration of an intelligent man who had been sent to understand what he was looking at. He wrote that the Ottoman soldier was more disciplined than his European counterpart, better fed on campaign, and more consistently paid, and that these practical advantages translated directly into military effectiveness in ways that European commanders were still working to replicate. He was not flattering an enemy, he was advising an emperor, and what Europe was facing was not simply a military challenge, it was an administrative one. The Ottoman campaign system worked because it was embedded in a state apparatus capable of sustaining it. The treasury that paid the janissaries, the supply network that fed the army on campaign, the provincial administration that provided the recruits and the resources, these were not improvised for each campaign. They were permanent institutional structures that functioned continuously and could be scaled up for a major offensive without the emergency reorganization that European kingdoms had to undertake each time they wanted to put a large army in the field. This is why the speed of the Ottoman response after Suleiman took the throne was so alarming to Europe. He did not need to build a war machine. He inherited one that was already running. The European response to this challenge was, for most of the period between 1521 and 1540, inadequate, and the inadequacy was structural rather than simply a matter of individual failure. The Holy Roman Empire, the natural counterweight to Ottoman power in Central Europe, was simultaneously dealing with 3 crises that each would have been serious on their own. The Protestant Reformation had begun in 1517, and by the 1520s the religious unity of the Holy Roman Empire was fracturing in ways with profound political consequences. Protestant princes, who might otherwise have contributed forces to the defence of Hungary, were negotiating with the emperor about their religious rights, and the emperor needed their cooperation too much to insist on military commitments they were reluctant to give. Then there was the rivalry with France. Francis I and Charles V were engaged in a contest for European dominance that consumed resources and attention that might otherwise have been available for the Ottoman frontier. The rivalry was so intense that Francis would eventually approach Suleiman for a strategic arrangement against the Habsburgs, a decision that produced outrage across Christian Europe, but that reflected a cold strategic logic that both parties understood perfectly. And there were the internal politics of the Habsburg territories themselves, the competing interests of nobles who each had their own priorities and their own interpretation of what the imperial interest required. Charles V managing all 3 of these crises simultaneously. was one of the most capable rulers of the 16th century, and he was still overwhelmed by the combination. Into this fracture, Suleiman drove his campaigns with the precision of a man who had studied the terrain carefully before he moved. The failure to take Vienna in 1529 and the failure to reach Vienna in 1532 were not failures of the Ottoman military system. They were demonstrations of its logistical limit at a specific distance from its supply base under specific seasonal conditions. The system worked as designed. The distance was simply too great for the season available. Suleiman understood this. He shifted his strategic focus toward the Mediterranean, where the logistical constraints were different and where a different kind of contest was developing that would define the middle decades of his reign. But he left something behind in Central Europe that would shape the region for a century. The ring of fortifications built and rebuilt along the Hungarian frontier in the decades after Mohacs. The investment in artillery and trained infantry that Charles and his successors made in direct response to the Ottoman challenge. The changes in how European states organized their armies and financed their defenses. Scholars of the period, including Geoffrey Parker in his work on the military revolution, have identified the Ottoman challenge as one important pressure among several that accelerated European military change in the 16th century, contributing alongside other factors to the development of the professional armies and systematic fortification programs that would reshape European warfare over the following generations. He left a permanent mark on the continent he never fully conquered. That mark outlasted every individual campaign he ran, and it was built not from victory but from the sustained pressure of an opponent who forced an entire civilization to reckon with its own limitations. He had shown Europe what it was facing. Now he turned to build the world he was governing. Chapter 6. Ibrahim, the friend he should not have trusted. There is a night in March of 1536 that the Ottoman court remembered for years afterward, not because of what was announced, but because of what was not. Ibrahim Pasha went to dinner with the Sultan. He had done this hundreds of times. The two men had been dining together, talking through the night, arguing about poetry and politics and the management of the empire, since they were young men in the provinces, since before either of them had any idea that one of them would one day rule the world. The dinners were one of the few spaces in Suleiman's life that belonged to something other than the performance of power, a place where the Sultan could be, if not simply a man, then at least something closer to one than the throne room allowed. Ibrahim went to dinner. He did not come out. By morning he was dead, killed by the methods the Ottoman court employed for executions that required proximity and finality. Men who moved through the palace in the small hours, carrying the Sultan's final judgments to the people they concerned. His body was buried without ceremony. His property was confiscated. His name was removed from official documents. The court absorbed the information with the practiced stillness of people who understood that expressing the wrong reaction to an execution was itself a form of political statement. Foreign ambassadors filed their dispatches with the careful neutrality of men who were trying to understand what had happened without appearing to judge it. Suleiman did not make a public statement. He did not explain. In the Ottoman system, the Sultan did not explain. The execution was the explanation. But the explanation that the execution provided was not complete, and it has never become complete, because the full account of why Suleiman killed the person he loved most in the world is not available in the sources, and has been debated by historians ever since. To understand the execution, you have to go back to the beginning of Ibrahim's ascent, because the thing that destroyed him was built into the thing that made him. Ibrahim had become Grand Vizier in 1523, at the age of roughly 29, in an appointment that bypassed every convention of the Ottoman system. He had no military record. He had no administrative experience in the provincial positions that normally served as preparation for senior office. He had the Sultan's friendship and nothing else. And the Sultan's friendship turned out to be sufficient. He proved, in the first years of his tenure, to be genuinely capable. He managed the court with intelligence. He served as the Sultan's representative in diplomatic negotiations with European powers and handled those negotiations with a sophistication that impressed the Venetian ambassadors, who were the most professionally sceptical observers in Europe. Scholars who have examined the Ottoman archival record of this period, including the detailed work done on the Topkapi Palace archives in the late 20th century, describe Ibrahim as one of the genuinely gifted administrators of the era, a man who would have been remarkable in any position, and who in his actual position had the additional advantage of knowing his principal better than everyone else alive. But the position did something to Ibrahim that the friendship had not. Power, in the Ottoman system, was not simply an administrative tool. It was a visible, physical, daily reality that expressed itself through ceremony and deference and the particular quality of attention that people paid to those who held it. Ibrahim held more of it than anyone in the empire except the Sultan, and the accumulation of that attention, year after year, seemed to alter something in his understanding of his own position. He began to behave as though the power were his rather than lent. The signs were gradual at first. He began to refer to himself in correspondence with foreign powers, using titles that implied an equivalence with the Sultan that no Ottoman official was supposed to claim. According to contemporary accounts, he began styling himself with combinations of titles that went beyond what his office warranted, including language that drew on the word Sultan itself, a title that belonged to the Sultan alone and was not available for borrowing. Suleiman appears to have noticed this and to have let it pass, which was itself a signal. It may have been the tolerance of a man who understood his friend's growing vanity and was willing to overlook it for the sake of what the friendship provided. It may have been the deliberate patience of a sultan who was waiting for the accumulation of evidence to reach a threshold before acting. Or it may have been something more complicated. The response of a man who loved his friend and was trying not to see what he was seeing. The negotiations with the French ambassadors in 1533 illustrate the problem with particular clarity. France and the Ottoman Empire were formalizing an alliance against the Habsburgs, and Ibrahim conducted the negotiations on the Ottoman side with considerable skill. But the way he positioned himself in the ceremonial exchanges, the language he used in the discussions, suggested to the French ambassadors that they were dealing with something close to an equal sovereign rather than a minister. The French dispatches describe Ibrahim in terms that are remarkable for what they imply about his self-presentation. Whether he was genuinely communicating independent authority or performing it for diplomatic effect is a question the sources do not resolve clearly. But the performance had consequences inside the Ottoman court that were more important than whatever impression it made in Paris. It made enemies. The senior officials who had watched Ibrahim rise over their heads in 1523 had spent the following years accommodating his position because they had no choice. The Sultan's favour was the Sultan's favour, and it could not be challenged directly. But they had been watching, and they had been waiting, and as Ibrahim's behaviour became more conspicuous, The patience of the court's senior figures was wearing thin. There was also the question of Hürrem Sultan, the woman who was becoming the most important person in Suleiman's personal life, and Ibrahim occupied the same space of confidence around the Sultan, in the sense that both had his complete trust. Their visions of what that trust should be used for were not always compatible. The historian Leslie Peirce argues, in her work on the Ottoman imperial household, that the conflict between Ibrahim and Hürrem has been significantly exaggerated in popular historiography, and that the evidence for a direct and sustained campaign by Hürrem against Ibrahim is thinner than the dramatic narrative often requires. She cautions against treating Hürrem as the primary cause of Ibrahim's execution, when the causes were structural and rooted in Ibrahim's own conduct. This is a reasonable caution, and one that serious engagement with the sources supports. What is not in doubt is that Ibrahim's behaviour had, over 13 years as Grand Vizier, created the conditions for his own end. A Grand Vizier who used the Sultan's authority as though it were his own, who styled himself beyond his office, who made consequential decisions without authorization, was a Grand Vizier who was, over time, becoming something that the Ottoman system identified as the most dangerous possible thing. He was becoming a centre of power independent of the Sultan. In the Ottoman understanding of political reality, an independent centre of power was not simply a political problem, it was an existential threat. The entire structure of the empire rested on the principle that all authority flowed from the Sultan and returned to him, that every official governed at his pleasure and by his grant, that no one could accumulate enough independent authority to survive the withdrawal of the Sultan's favour. Ibrahim had been accumulating exactly that kind of authority for 13 years. The court saw it. Senior officials saw it. Foreign ambassadors saw it and wrote home about it with the careful astonishment of people describing something they could not quite believe they were watching. Whether Suleiman saw it, and if he saw it when he decided he had seen enough, is the question that haunts the execution. His personal diary, from the period just before Ibrahim's death, has been examined by scholars looking for evidence of his state of mind. In the interpretation of historians who have worked with these documents, the entries from this period suggest inner conflict. A man wrestling with a decision that he knows he has to make and that he does not want to make. Whether this reading is fully supported by the documents themselves is debated, as it must be when the primary sources are as indirect as these are. What is not debated is the outcome. On the night of March 14th, 1536, Ibrahim Pasha had dinner with Suleiman in the private apartments of Topkapi Palace. He had been Grand Vizier for 13 years. He was approximately 41 years old. He had governed more of the Ottoman Empire's affairs than any man alive except the Sultan himself. He went to sleep. He did not wake up. Suleiman's poetry from the years after Ibrahim's death has been examined by scholars for signs of grief, and the evidence is there. Not in direct lament, which would have been a political statement he could not make, but in the recurrence of certain themes. Loss, the unreliability of worldly attachment, the distance between what we want from those we love and what we are able to hold on to, the particular quality of absence that comes when someone who has always been present is suddenly, permanently gone. He had ordered the execution. He lived with it for the remaining 30 years of his life. The question of whether it was the right decision admits of two answers that are both true. As a political decision, it was probably necessary. Ibrahim's behaviour had reached a point where the structural logic of the Ottoman system required an ending. And a sultan who could not enforce the boundaries of his own authority was a sultan whose authority was beginning to erode. The execution was Suleiman demonstrating to the court and to the empire that no one, regardless of their intimacy with the sultan, stood outside the fundamental rules. As a human decision, it was the kind of thing that changes a person permanently, because you cannot order the execution of the person who knows you best without altering, in some irreversible way, your relationship with the idea that closeness is safe. He never had another friendship like it. He was not capable of one. The palace was quieter after that. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of a man who had learned, at the cost of the one friendship his life had contained, exactly what kind of world he was living in. He had always known, but knowing something and having it confirmed in the most final possible way are different things. And Suleiman carried that difference with him from March of 1536 until the tent at Szigetvár 30 years later. He was still carrying it when he died. Chapter 7. Roxelana, the woman who rewrote the rules. Begin with a girl on a road she did not choose. Somewhere in the region that is now Ukraine, in the early 1520s, a raid moves through a village at dawn. The Crimean Tatars who conduct these raids along the frontier of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth do so with the practiced efficiency of people who have been doing it for generations. And the people on the receiving end have learned, at terribly cost, that there is very little to be done when the riders arrive. Some people flee, some hide, some are taken. She is taken. She is probably in her early to mid-teens. She does not know, in the first hours and days of what has happened to her, that she is being moved toward Constantinople, toward one of the most powerful courts in the world, toward a life that no one standing on that road in the early morning could have imagined for her. She knows only that she is gone from everything she has known, and that the world she is moving through is entirely unfamiliar. She will spend the rest of her life making the unfamiliar into something she owns completely. Her original name is not known with certainty. The name Roxelana, by which she became known in Europe, was not her Ottoman name. It was a European label derived from the Latin word for Ruthenian, essentially a geographic description rather than a personal name. In the Ottoman sources she appears as Hürrem, a Persian word meaning the joyful one. Whether it was given to her by the palace household when she arrived, or by Suleiman himself, or whether it reflected something in her actual personality, the sources do not clearly establish. What the sources do establish, with remarkable consistency across multiple independent accounts, is that she was noticed almost immediately. The Ottoman imperial harem is one of the most misunderstood institutions in Islamic history. Misunderstood primarily because the European imagination of the 16th century, and the centuries that followed, constructed an image of it that served European purposes rather than reflecting Ottoman reality. The image of an exotic enclosure of idle women competing for a sultan's physical attention is a fantasy, and it is a fantasy that has obscured what the institution actually was. The harem was the sultan's household. It was the domestic space of the Ottoman court, organized around the sultan's family and personal life, staffed by women who ranged from enslaved servants to the sultan's mother, to the senior women who managed the household with the authority and organizational sophistication that running a complex institution required. It was a place of real political weight, because proximity to the Sultan's household was proximity to the Sultan, and the women who managed that proximity were engaged in the same calculations of interest and influence that occupied the men in the outer court. The Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, was the most powerful person in the harem, and often one of the most consequential figures in the empire. Hafsa Sultan, Suleiman's mother, traditionally identified in Ottoman sources as being of Crimean origin, had been a significant political figure in the early years of his reign, a source of counsel who commanded genuine respect from the court until her death in 1534. Into this world, Hürrem arrived as a new enslaved girl with no particular status and no protection beyond whatever qualities she possessed. She possessed considerable qualities. The Venetian ambassador Pietro Bragadin, reporting to the Venetian Senate in 1526, described her as not conventionally beautiful in the formal portrait style of the era, but possessed of a quality he found difficult to precisely define. Something in her bearing and her intelligence that distinguished her from the other women of the household in ways that he, as an outsider who had only glimpsed her at formal occasions, could observe but not fully explain. She had the quality of making you aware of her when she was in the room. Suleiman was aware of her. The evidence of when exactly his attention focused on her is scattered across sources of varying reliability, but by the mid-1520s she was clearly more to him than one woman among many. He was writing her poetry. He was writing her letters. He was doing something that Ottoman sultans did not do, which was engaging with a woman of the harem as an intellectual and emotional equal, as a person whose mind interested him and whose presence he sought, not simply for physical reasons, but for the quality of engagement that she provided. The letters have survived, at least in part. They are among the more remarkable documents of the period. In the assessment of scholars, including Leslie Peirce, who has worked extensively with these primary sources, they are the letters of a man in love, in a way that was both completely recognizable and genuinely unprecedented, given who the man was and what the position he occupied required him to be. He called her his spring, his joy, his beloved. He described the pain of separation during campaigns in language that was not political metaphor but straightforward emotional expression. He was telling a woman who had no formal status, no family to protect her, no power except what he gave her, that she was the centre of his emotional life. She wrote back. Her letters have also survived in portions, and they engage with Suleiman's correspondence not simply with affection, but with intelligence, with observations about the court and the world outside the palace that demonstrated a mind that had been paying close attention to everything around it from the moment she arrived. She was not simply receiving his love, she was participating in a conversation, and the conversation was one that Suleiman valued in ways that went beyond what any of his official relationships could provide. The formal legal structure of the Ottoman imperial household made concubinage the normal arrangement for enslaved women in the harem. A concubine who bore the Sultan a son acquired a specific status and a specific set of protections, but she was not a wife. Ottoman sultans did not marry. The institution of legitimate royal marriage had been set aside by the Ottoman dynasty generations earlier, precisely because a legally married wife, especially one from a foreign royal family, created the possibility of foreign interference in Ottoman succession politics that the dynasty had decided it could not afford. The Sultan had concubines. He had a household. He did not have a wife. Suleiman married Hürrem. The exact date of the marriage is uncertain, and it is not recorded in a single definitive Ottoman document because the marriage was itself so far outside normal practice that the court's record-keeping apparatus had no established category for it. The historian Leslie Peirce, drawing on a combination of Ottoman legal documents, diplomatic reports, and the language used to describe Hürrem in official correspondence from the period onward, suggests it probably took place sometime in the 1530s, most likely around 1533 or 1534. Contemporary European ambassadors reported the marriage with the astonishment appropriate to an event that violated every known convention of Ottoman dynastic practice. The Venetian ambassadors described it as unprecedented and noted that the court had absorbed it with the careful neutrality of people who understood that expressing opinions about the Sultan's domestic arrangements was not a safe activity. Why did Suleiman do it? The simplest answer, which is also probably the most accurate, is that he did it because he wanted to, and because he was the Sultan and the Sultan's will, in domestic matters as in political ones, was ultimately not subject to external constraint. The Ottoman tradition against marriage had been practical rather than principled. It had been designed to prevent a specific political problem. The accumulation of power by a consort's family through their connection to the Sultanate. Hürrem had no family in any position to accumulate political power through the connection. She was a woman whose entire existence was within the Ottoman system. The political logic that argued against royal marriage did not apply to her in the same way it applied to a princess from a foreign dynasty. He freed her from enslaved status. He married her. He gave her the title of Haseki Sultan. She became the legal wife of one of the most powerful rulers of his age. The implications of this for the dynamics of the court were profound and worked themselves out over the following decades in ways that were consequential for the empire and personally devastating for several people whose stories appear in later chapters. But the immediate effect was simpler and more human than the political analysis captures. Suleiman had given the woman he loved everything the Ottoman system allowed him to give her. She had been taken from her home as a girl, enslaved, brought to a foreign court in a foreign country speaking a foreign language, and she had navigated that world with an intelligence and a force of character that had brought her to a position no woman in the history of the Ottoman dynasty had ever occupied. That navigation deserves examination without the romantic framework that popular historiography has usually provided. Because the romantic framework, while not entirely wrong, is incomplete. Hürrem's position in the court was precarious in ways that Suleiman's love did not fully resolve. She was foreign. She was of enslaved origin. She had no family network to protect her if circumstances shifted. She had no precedent to guide her about what her position meant or what it required. She was operating without a map. What she had was intelligence, the ability to read the court with unusual precision, and the quality of attention that Suleiman had noticed from the beginning. She used these to build, gradually, and without the kind of dramatic manoeuvring that legend attributes to her, a position of genuine and durable security. She bore Suleiman 6 children, 5 sons and a daughter. The daughter, Mihrimah, became one of the significant figures of the period in her own right. A patron of architecture whose commissions included major mosque complexes in Constantinople and Edirne, a woman whose influence on Ottoman cultural life lasted decades after her mother's death. She would become In the judgment of the historian Gülru Nesipoglu, one of the most architecturally active royal women of the 16th century, the sons became the succession, and the succession became the tragedy that the next chapter will examine directly. But before the tragedy, there was something else, something that the historiography does not always give adequate weight to, because it is harder to dramatize than the conflict and the intrigue. There were the letters. Suleiman wrote to her from every campaign. She wrote back. The correspondence continued across more than 3 decades of marriage, across all the political complications and the court conflicts and the terrible decisions about their children that were still to come. In the assessment of scholars who have worked with these documents, the letters remained throughout that period the correspondence of 2 people who were genuinely engaged with each other's minds, who found in each other something that the rest of their world did not provide. Think about what that means for a moment. This was a man who governed one of the largest empires of the early modern world, who spent months of every year on campaign in conditions that required everything he had, who managed court politics of extraordinary complexity and succession anxieties that would have broken most people. And he wrote letters, regular, careful, affectionate letters to a woman in a palace on the Bosphorus, letters that said, underneath all the poetry and the formal flourish, something very simple. I am here. I am thinking of you. I will come home. She also managed the foundation of charitable institutions in Constantinople, endowing a mosque complex, a school, a hospital, a public bathhouse, a soup kitchen for the poor. These were not simply gestures of piety. They were the expression of a woman who understood that the most durable form of presence was not proximity to the Sultan, but the kind of permanence built into the physical fabric of the city, that would survive political shifts because it existed in stone and in the daily lives of the people who used it. She was building. The same quality that had made Suleiman a builder of legal codes and architectural monuments was present in the woman he had chosen, and it expressed itself in the same medium. She died in 1558, 8 years before Suleiman, having been ill for some time. The nature of her illness is not identified with precision in contemporary sources. Suleiman's diary from the period around her death reflects, in the careful reading of scholars who have worked with these documents, the characteristic restraint of a man who had spent a lifetime governing his public expression. The grief is there in the spaces between the entries, in the quality of absence that a diary acquires when the person writing it has lost something that was part of the architecture of daily life for more than 30 years. He was 58 years old when she died. He had 8 years left. The letters stopped. The campaigns continued. But the centre of the life, the person to whom the letters had been written for 3 decades, was gone. He was alone in the way that people are alone, when the one person who truly knew them is no longer there to confirm that they were real. He had given her everything the Ottoman system allowed. It had not been enough to keep her. Nothing ever is. Chapter 8. Lawgiver, the empire he built at home. There is a building in Constantinople that tells you more about Suleiman than any battlefield. Walk through its gate on a morning when the light comes in low from the east, and something shifts in you before you can name what it is. The courtyard is enormous and ordered, the stone warm in the early sun. The central dome floats above the prayer hall with a lightness that contradicts the physics of what is holding it up. The windows fill the interior with a quality of light that feels deliberate, as though whoever designed this understood that light was not decoration but language. In the garden behind the mosque, in a tomb that is simple and quiet and easy to miss if you are not looking for it, Suleiman is buried, Hürrem beside him. They have been there since the 16th century. The mosque complex is called the Suleymaniye. It stands on the third of the 7 hills of the city, visible from the water, visible from the Asian shore across the Bosphorus, visible from the minarets of the older mosques that surrounded it when it was built, and that it immediately surpassed in scale and in the quality of stillness it imposed on everything around it. It took 7 years to complete. It was designed by a man named Sinan, the son of a stonecutter from Anatolia who had been taken through the Devshirme system, educated as a military engineer, and had spent decades building bridges and barracks and fortifications before the Sultan gave him the commission that would define both their legacies. The complex was not simply a mosque, it was a city within the city, organized around the idea that the purpose of imperial power was to provide. It included a hospital, a medical school, 4 madrasas for religious and legal education, a primary school, same, a caravanserai for travellers, a soup kitchen that fed hundreds of people daily at no charge, a bathhouse, and the tombs of Suleiman and Hürrem in the garden behind. It was completed in 1557, 9 years before Suleiman's death, and it was intended as a statement, not a statement of military power, though the empire that funded it was among the most militarily powerful of its era, not simply a statement of religious authority, though the man who built it was the guardian of the 2 holiest sites in Islam. It was a statement about what governance was for. Suleiman had spent his entire reign insisting on this, in ways that went beyond the rhetorical. The Suleymaniye was the physical expression of that insistence, carved in stone on a hillside above the Golden Horn for anyone who wanted to understand what this particular sultan understood his power to be for. The architect Sinan understood the assignment. Koca Mimar Sinan is considered by architectural historians to be one of the most significant builders in the history of the discipline, and the assessment is not hyperbole. He designed or supervised the construction of more than 300 structures during his career, which spanned the reigns of Suleiman and 2 subsequent sultans, and lasted until his death in 1588. The scholar Abdullah Quran, in his foundational study of Sinan's architecture, describes him as someone who solved structural problems that had challenged builders in the Islamic world for centuries, and who did so with an elegance that made the solutions look inevitable rather than achieved. The challenge Sinan faced at the Suleymaniye was the challenge that had occupied Islamic architecture since the construction of the Hagia Sophia in the 6th century, a building that stood a few hundred meters from the site of Suleiman's new mosque. How do you cover an enormous area with a dome without making the walls below it so thick and heavy that the interior becomes a series of dark tunnels rather than a unified sacred space? Sinan studied the Hagia Sophia with the systematic attention of an engineer trying to understand a solution before improving on it. What he achieved at the Suleymaniye was a structural system that distributed the dome's weight through a series of arches and semi-domes and exterior buttresses in a way that freed the interior walls from the load-bearing function that had forced previous builders to make them massive and opaque. The walls of the prayer hall are filled with windows. The interior is flooded with light. The dome floats. He built for Suleiman across 4 decades. The commissions ranged from the Suleymaniye in Constantinople to bridges across the rivers of the Balkans, from caravanserais serving travellers across the trade routes of the empire to water systems that rebuilt the supply infrastructure of the capital. The scholar Gülru Necipoglu, in her comprehensive study of Sinan's architecture, published in 2005, argues that the building program was a systematic attempt to embed the Ottoman presence in the physical fabric of the territories it governed, to make the empire useful in ways that military control alone could not achieve. A mosque that served a community for centuries was a different kind of imperial statement than a garrison that occupied a city. It was a statement that the empire intended to be there permanently, that it understood governance as requiring investment in the places it governed, that the relationship between the Ottoman state and its subjects was not simply extractive, but contained an obligation that ran in both directions. This understanding of governance as obligation expressed itself most clearly in the legal work that earned Suleiman the title his own people gave him, Kanuni, the Lawgiver. The Ottoman legal system in the early 16th century operated simultaneously on 2 tracks that were theoretically complementary but practically in constant tension. One track was the Sharia, the Islamic religious law administered by judges called qadis. The other track was the Kanun, the secular law promulgated by the Sultan through his own legislative authority, covering areas that Sharia did not address directly and varying from region to region in ways that created confusion and inconsistency across an empire of enormous geographic and cultural diversity. The Ottoman Empire was not a homogeneous state. It was a collection of peoples, religion, languages, and local traditions brought under a single political authority without being required to abandon their particular identities. The empire's population included Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Yevs, Serbs, Hungarians, Egyptians, Berbers, Persians, Kurds, and dozens of other communities, each with their own legal traditions and their own economic customs. Managing this diversity required a legal framework sophisticated enough to accommodate it without either imposing a uniform standard that would alienate every community it touched, or allowing such complete local autonomy that the empire fragmented into a collection of independent principalities that happened to pay taxes to Constantinople. Suleiman's contribution was the systematic organization of existing regulations into coherent legal codes that applied consistently across the empire. The revision of regulations that had become contradictory or outdated, and the extension of legal protection to groups that previous codes had left inadequately covered. The historian Halil Inalcik, whose decades of archival work on Ottoman social and economic history are considered foundational in the field, describes Suleiman's legal reforms as representing a qualitative shift in Ottoman governance, a movement toward a framework in which the Sultan's authority was itself bounded by legal principles, even if those principles remained ultimately subject to sultanic revision. The legal code addressed an enormous range of practical matters: taxation, land tenure, criminal punishment, the legal status of different communities, the rights and obligations of various categories of subjects, the conduct of trade. What distinguished it from earlier Ottoman legal compilations was the degree to which it engaged with the actual conditions of Ottoman subjects rather than simply organizing the administrative requirements of the state. Suleiman had spent years as a provincial governor, and the experience had given him an understanding of how law touched ordinary life, that purely theoretical legal education could not have provided. He knew that a tax code, written without understanding the actual productive capacity of the people it taxed, would generate resistance rather than revenue. He knew that legal systems incomprehensible to the people they governed produced not order but the particular disorder of people who have no reliable way to resolve disputes. He also reformed the treatment of the non-Muslim communities within the empire. The millet system through which the Ottoman state organized its relationship with Christian and Jewish populations was not equality. Non-Muslim subjects paid additional taxes and operated under certain legal constraints that reflected the Islamic legal framework within which the empire operated. But within those constraints, the system provided a degree of legal autonomy and religious freedom that was, by the standards of 16th century Europe, unusual. The Jews who had been expelled from Spain in 1492 and from Portugal in 1497 had found refuge in the Ottoman Empire. Settling in Constantinople and Thessaloniki and other Ottoman cities, where they established communities that became significant contributors to Ottoman commercial and intellectual life. Suleiman's legal reforms clarified, and in some respects strengthened the protections these communities enjoyed. The physician Joseph Hayman, whose family had come from Spain, served as Suleiman's personal doctor and was, by the accounts of those who knew the court, someone whose counsel the Sultan sought on matters that went beyond medicine. The intellectual culture of Suleiman's court was genuinely cosmopolitan in ways that the ideological framings of the period, on both the European and Ottoman sides, tended to obscure. Think for a moment about what kind of man this describes. He was a man who led campaigns that broke kingdoms and reshaped the map of Europe and the Middle East. He was also a man who spent years thinking carefully about tax codes and the legal status of minority communities. He was a man who executed his closest friend, and whose reign was marked by the violence that the Ottoman succession system required. He was also a man who built hospitals and soup kitchens and schools, and endowed them for the use of people who would never know his name. He was not one of these things and not the other. He was all of them simultaneously, and the difficulty of holding all of them in view at once is part of what makes him genuinely interesting rather than simply impressive. On certain mornings, before the crowds arrive and the city wakes fully around it, the garden behind the Suleymaniye is quiet in the way that very few places in a city of millions can be quiet. You can stand there in the early light, with the dome above you and the Bosphorus below, and feel, without needing the historical record to explain it, that whoever built this understood something about what human life is for. He is there. In the garden, he has been there since 1566. He is still telling you what he believed. Chapter 9. The Mediterranean Duel with Charles V. There is a man who does not appear in most popular accounts of Suleiman's reign, whose name is not as well known as Ibrahim's or Hürrem's, but whose influence on the shape of the 16th century Mediterranean world was as consequential as any single battle or any diplomatic agreement. His name was Hayreddin, and without him, the story of Suleiman's empire is incomplete. Hayreddin Barbarossa was not born an Ottoman. He was born, probably around 1478, on the Greek island of Lesbos, the son of a father of Turkish origin and a Greek mother, and he grew up in the mixed cultural world of the Eastern Aegean that the Ottoman conquest of the Greek islands had created. He and his brother Arouj became sea raiders, operating in the western Mediterranean with a combination of seamanship and ferocity that made them among the most feared figures on those waters within a decade. To call them simply pirates understates what they were. They were strategic actors, operating in the political vacuum of the western Mediterranean, where the Ottoman state had not yet established effective presence, and where the decaying remnants of North African kingdoms and the expanding Spanish presence along that coast had created exactly the kind of instability that capable and ambitious men could exploit. After Arouge was killed fighting the Spanish in 1518, Hayreddin offered his territories on the North African coast to Selim the First in exchange for Ottoman backing. Selim accepted. Hayreddin became an Ottoman governor, and the North African coast became Ottoman territory. But it was under Suleiman that Hayreddin became something much larger. In 1533, Suleiman summoned Hayreddin to Constantinople. The summons could have meant appointment or execution, and Hayreddin understood both possibilities as he made the journey from North Africa to the Ottoman capital. He arrived as a man who had spent 30 years surviving in conditions where the alternative to survival was final, and he carried that quality of presence with him into the palace. There are accounts from the period that describe the meeting between the two men with the particular attention of observers who recognized that they were watching something unusual. Two figures whose capability operated at roughly the same scale encountering each other for the first time. Suleiman received him. He appointed Hayreddin Kapudan Pasha Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet. It was a remarkable decision. The appointment of a man who was not a product of the Ottoman institutional hierarchy, who had made his career entirely outside the system, who was by temperament and experience a sea commander rather than a court official. Suleiman made the appointment because he understood what Hayreddin could do, that the Ottoman naval establishment, for all its resources, had not been able to do on its own. He could win in the western Mediterranean. The Ottoman fleet in the early 1500s was not weak. It had significant resources and had conducted successful operations in the eastern Mediterranean. But the western Mediterranean was a different theatre, dominated by Spanish and Genoese fleets that were the most experienced sea fighters of the age. Hayreddin had spent 30 years fighting exactly those opponents. He knew their tactics, their strengths, their weaknesses. He knew the winds and the currents of the western Mediterranean in the intimate way of someone who had sailed them since his youth. And he had the particular quality of naval command that no amount of institutional training can reliably produce. The ability to read a battle as it develops and adjust to conditions that no planning process could fully anticipate. The historian John Gill Martin, whose work on 16th century Mediterranean warfare is considered authoritative in the field, identifies Hayreddin as one of the outstanding naval commanders of the era, a judgment that the record of his operations consistently supports. To understand the contest this sets up, you have to understand who was on the other side. Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain, was the most powerful single ruler in Europe and one of the most consequential figures of the 16th century. He was simultaneously Suleiman's greatest opponent and in certain ways his mirror image, a man governing an empire of comparable complexity and comparable internal contradictions, dealing with religious fracture and succession anxiety and military overextension in ways that rhymed with Suleiman's challenges, even as they differed in their specific form. There was a moment in 1525 when the parallel between them became almost uncomfortably clear. Francis I of France had been captured by Charles at the Battle of Pavia and spent a year as a Habsburg prisoner. When he was finally released, having signed agreements he immediately repudiated. He sent a message to Suleiman seeking support against Charles. Here were two of the most powerful rulers in Europe and the Islamic world, the French king and the Ottoman Sultan, finding common cause against the man whose empire they each, for different reasons, found intolerable. Suleiman responded. The exchange was the beginning of a diplomatic relationship that would formalize in 1536 and that would shape Mediterranean and European politics for decades. The strategic logic was simple. An Ottoman Empire pressing the Habsburgs from the east and south relieved pressure on France. A France fighting Charles in Italy and the Netherlands prevented the full concentration of Habsburg resources against the Ottomans. This arrangement shocked Christian Europe. The idea that a Christian king would make a formal strategic arrangement with the Ottoman Sultan violated every framework through which European political culture understood itself. The Pope was furious. Charles was furious. European writers produced a torrent of material attacking Francis for what they described as betrayal of the faith. Francis and Suleiman were not particularly troubled by the reaction. They were operating by a different framework entirely, one in which the relevant categories were not Christian and Muslim, but Habsburg and anti-Habsburg. The historian Friedrich Hitzel, in his work on Franco-Ottoman relations, argues that the alliance represented a significant moment in European diplomatic history, an early clear example of a state explicitly setting aside the religious framework of international relations in favour of a purely strategic calculus. The difference between Suleiman and Charles, strategically, was one of focus. Suleiman's strategic priorities in the Mediterranean could be organised around a relatively coherent set of objectives. Charles was governing an empire that required his attention simultaneously in Spain, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and Central Europe. Every campaign in one theatre drew resources from elsewhere, and the elsewhere problems did not wait. This structural asymmetry shaped everything that followed. In 1534, Hayreddin conducted operations along the Italian coast that demonstrated the Ottoman fleet's reach into the central Mediterranean in ways that alarmed the Italian courts and made the Habsburg position in the region feel considerably less secure than it had. The operations were swift and systematic, a demonstration of capability rather than a major territorial campaign, and they achieved exactly what a demonstration is supposed to achieve. They made the audience pay attention. In 1535, Charles launched a major expedition to retake Tunis, which Hayreddin had seized the previous year, and succeeded, installing a client ruler. It was a genuine military achievement and demonstrated that the Habsburgs could project power into North Africa when they concentrated resources, but concentration was always the problem. The Battle of Preveza in 1538 was the moment when the strategic balance became clearly visible. A Holy League fleet assembled by Pope Paul III, consisting of Spanish, Venetian, Genoese, and papal vessels under the command of the Genoese admiral Andrea Doria, encountered the Ottoman fleet under Hayreddin near the Greek coast at the entrance to the Gulf of Arta. The Holy League fleet was larger and had more guns. By the conventional calculation of naval power at the time, it should have won. It did not win. Hayreddin used his knowledge of the local winds and his understanding of Doria's tactical preferences to manoeuvre the Ottoman fleet into a position where the Holy League could not engage on favourable terms. Daria, aware of his disadvantage, chose not to press a battle and withdrew. The Holy League fleet retreated without achieving its objective. The historian John Gill Martin describes Preveza as a demonstration of tactical mastery rather than a crushing engagement, a battle won through superior positioning and the exploitation of the opponent's caution rather than through direct destruction of the enemy fleet. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of victory that a commander of Hayreddin's quality would produce, won in the mind before it was won on the water. The consequence was the establishment of Ottoman naval dominance as a strategic fact that the other powers of the Mediterranean had to organize their planning around. Venice, a civilization that had been the dominant commercial power in the eastern Mediterranean for centuries, signed a peace treaty with the Ottomans in 1540 that acknowledged Ottoman control of territory and trade routes it had previously contested. A civilization was adjusting to a new reality. In 1543, the Ottoman fleet under Hayreddin wintered in the French port of Toulon, a moment of extraordinary symbolic weight. The most capable naval force in the western Mediterranean was docked in a French harbour, welcomed by the French king. Its sailors moving through the streets of a southern French city on their winter leave. The population of the surrounding region watched with the complicated feelings of people who were simultaneously grateful for powerful allies and deeply uncertain about what those allies represented. That winter in Toulon was Hayreddin at his most emblematic. He was in his mid-60s by then, a man who had spent his entire adult life operating in the spaces between the great powers, accumulating the specific authority that comes from being indispensable to people more powerful than yourself. He walked through Toulon as the Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, dined with French officials who needed him, and prepared his ships for the season ahead, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 40 years and intended to continue. He returned to Constantinople in 1544. He died there in 1546. At approximately the age of 68, he died in his bed, which, given the life he had lived, was itself a kind of achievement. Suleiman stood at a threshold that he had stood at before. The empire continued. The fleet continued. But the particular human quality that Hayreddin had brought, the seamanship accumulated over 30 years of operations in waters the institutional Ottoman navy had never navigated before, was gone. The successors who followed him were capable without being exceptional in the same way. It was the same loss, in a different register, as Ibrahim, as Hafsa Sultan, as each of the people who had been irreplaceable and whose absence left a specific shape in the world that no one else quite filled. Charles V abdicated in 1556, exhausted by decades of governing an empire too large for any single person to govern well. He divided his territories between his son Philip II and his brother Ferdinand, and retired to a monastery in Spain where he spent his final years in the kind of quiet that his reign had never allowed him. There is a detail in Charles's final years that is worth sitting with for a moment. He was, by various accounts, obsessed in his retirement with clocks. He had dozens of them brought to the monastery, and he spent his days trying to synchronize them, to make them all tell exactly the same time. He could not make it work. No two clocks, however carefully made, kept exactly the same time. The attempt to impose perfect order on time itself became the quiet obsession of a man who had spent 40 years trying to impose order on an empire that was always running at different speeds in different places. Suleiman received the news of Charles's abdication from the man who had been fighting the empire Charles represented for 35 years. He was 61 years old. He had been Sultan for 36 years. He had outlasted Charles V. The Mediterranean was not won completely. The contest would continue under Philip and Ferdinand and the Ottoman sultans who would follow Suleiman. But it was, by any honest assessment of 1556, more Ottoman in its strategic character than it had been when Suleiman took the throne in 1520. The sea that the Romans had once called their own was shared now, and the sharing had been contested and costly. But the terms of the contest had been set by the man in Constantinople who had appointed Hayreddin to command his fleet, and who had watched from the palace on the Bosphorus as the world he had inherited became, year by year, significantly different from the world he had found. He had 1 decade left. The worst of what it would bring was still ahead. Chapter 10. The Sons a Succession, written in blood. There is a moment that does not appear in most histories of Suleiman's reign. A small and private moment that the court records do not capture, and that we only know about because of what surrounded it. Somewhere in the 1540s, in the private apartments of Topkapi Palace, Suleiman is writing a letter to his son Mustafa. The letter is referenced in Ottoman court records and described in the accounts of several contemporaries, though it has not survived in full. It was a letter of advice, the kind of letter that fathers write to sons they love and from whom they expect great things, full of counsel about governance and patience and the management of the court. It was written with the care of a man who was not simply performing fatherhood, but genuinely attempting to transmit something he understood to be valuable and fragile and worth preserving. It was written by a man who was, at the time of writing, already moving toward the decision that would destroy everything the letter represented. To understand what happened to Mustafa, you have to understand what Mustafa was. He was Suleiman's oldest surviving son, born in 1515 to a concubine named Mahidevran, traditionally identified in Ottoman sources as being of Circassian or Albanian origin, who had been part of Suleiman's household before Hürrem arrived, and whose position had been entirely displaced by Hürrem's rise. Mahidevran had given Suleiman his firstborn son at a moment when no one could have predicted what Hürrem would become, and the relationship between the two women, which the court observed with the attention of people who understood that it was also a succession contest, was one of sustained and mutual tension. Mustafa grew up to be, by the consistent testimony of Ottoman court chroniclers and foreign ambassadors alike, everything that a future sultan was supposed to be. He was physically imposing, intellectually capable, militarily gifted, and possessed of a quality of natural authority that people who encountered him described with the particular register reserved for something genuinely rare. The Venetian ambassador Bernardo Navagero, reporting to the Venetian Senate in 1550, described Mustafa as the most capable of Suleiman's sons, a man whose combination of military and intellectual qualities would make him, in Navagero's assessment, a very capable sultan indeed. He governed the provinces of Amasya and then Manisa, the traditional posting for Ottoman heirs apparent, with a competence that earned him genuine loyalty among the provincial populations and the military commanders who served under him. The Janissaries, whose opinion of a future sultan mattered enormously in the Ottoman succession system, admired him openly. This was the problem. A prince who was too capable, too popular, too obviously the best candidate for the throne, was a prince who was, in the Ottoman system, simultaneously the most qualified successor and the most dangerous potential challenge to the sitting sultan's authority, a sultan surrounded by officials and soldiers who were openly anticipating his replacement, was a sultan whose authority was being quietly undermined by the very existence of his son. Suleiman understood this. He had grown up in the system. He knew the logic from the inside. And the logic was not comfortable to know. The accusations against Mustafa, when they came, were of the specific kind that the Ottoman succession system was designed to produce. The charge was treason. Specifically, according to the accounts that reached the court, that Mustafa had been in contact with Shah Tahmasp of the Safavid Persian Empire and had been exploring an arrangement by which he would take the throne before his father's natural death. Whether these accusations were true is a question that Ottoman historians have debated for centuries, without reaching a definitive resolution. The Habsburg ambassador Ogier Giselin de Busbecq, whose letters from Constantinople are among the most valuable eyewitness accounts of the period, describes the accusations with the careful skepticism of a man who observed the court closely and who believed, based on his observations, that the evidence was thinner than the outcome required, and that the people who brought the accusations to the Sultan had their own reasons for doing so. Among those people was Rostem Pasha, the Grand Vizier, who was also the husband of Mihrimah, Suleiman and Hürrem's daughter, his position in the court, his connection to Hürrem through the marriage, and his interests in the succession question were factors that contemporaries noted and that historians have continued to examine. Whether Hürrem was directly involved in the accusations against Mustafa is a question that the evidence does not resolve clearly, and that popular historiography has tended to answer more definitively than the sources justify. Leslie Peirce, returning to this question in her work, argues that the evidence for direct Hürrem involvement is thinner than the narrative tradition often suggests, and that the structural incentives of the situation, a mother whose son's succession depended on the removal of a capable half-brother, do not, by themselves, constitute evidence of active conspiracy. The structural incentives were real. What Hürrem did with them is not established clearly enough to state as fact. What is established is what happened in the autumn of 1553. Suleiman was on campaign against the Safavids in Anatolia. Mustafa was summoned to his father's tent. He entered. He did not come out alive. He was killed in the tent by the methods the Ottoman system used for executions that required proximity and finality. The Ottoman historian Mustafa Ali, writing decades later, describes the scene in terms that place Suleiman present as the execution was carried out. Whether this specific detail is accurate or reflects later embellishment is not possible to verify from the sources. What is not disputed is that Suleiman ordered the death of his oldest son. The most capable person, most observers, expected to succeed him, on the basis of accusations whose evidentiary foundation serious contemporaries questioned. The reaction in the army was something the court had not fully anticipated. The Janissaries received the news of Mustafa's death with a grief that became something close to a mutiny. There were demonstrations in the camp. Senior officers made their feelings clear in ways that stopped just short of open insubordination. The atmosphere, according to Busbecq, was one of profound shock, and barely contained fury directed at the Sultan who had just killed the man they had expected to follow. Suleiman moved through this atmosphere with the controlled authority of a Sultan who understood that showing any sign of uncertainty would convert near mutiny into something worse. He maintained his composure. He enforced discipline. He did not reverse the decision. The army settled. But something had shifted in the empire's relationship with its sultan. A shift that the remaining years of his reign would not fully reverse. Think about what this cost him. He had lost Ibrahim, the friend who knew him best. He had lost Hafsa Sultan, the mother who had prepared him for everything. He had lost Hürrem, the woman who had been the centre of his personal life for 30 years. And now he had ordered the death of his most gifted son, the child he had written advice letters to, the young man he had watched become everything a sultan's heir was supposed to be. The poetry from this period, in the reading of scholars who have worked with these documents, carries a quality of accumulated grief that the earlier work does not contain in the same way. It is not self-pity. Suleiman was not a man who permitted himself self-pity, or at least not one who committed it to paper. It is something more like the specific weight of a man who has paid every price the system required and who is beginning to understand, with a clarity that comes only at a certain age and a certain accumulated cost, that the paying does not produce what it was supposed to produce. The sons who remained were Selim and Bayezid, both Hürrem's sons, and the question of which of them would succeed was settled not in the palace, but on a battlefield. The rivalry between them had been building for years. Both were aware that one of them was going to be the next sultan, and that the other was going to be dead. The Ottoman system offered no peaceful resolution to this problem. It never had. Bayezid was the younger and, in the assessment of many at court, the more intellectually capable of the two, more like Suleiman in temperament, and more genuinely engaged with the questions of governance that had occupied his father. He was also, by the accounts of those who knew him, more volatile, more likely to act on emotion rather than calculation. Selim was older and by most accounts less gifted. He drank, openly and to excess, a habit noted in the sources with the particular emphasis of observers who understood that it carried political significance in an Islamic court. He was less popular with the Janissaries than Bayezid was. He was also the one who won. The conflict between the brothers became open civil war in 1559, when Bayezid moved against Selim with military force and was defeated at the Battle of Konya, defeated and abandoned by most of his supporters. Bayezid fled east with his sons, seeking refuge with Shah Tahmasp of Persia, the same ruler whose alleged contacts with Mustafa had been part of the case for Mustafa's execution. The irony was not lost on contemporaries. Suleiman negotiated with Shah Tahmasp for the fate of Bayezid. The negotiations were extended and, according to the accounts of the period, involved significant Ottoman payments to the Persian court, though the precise details in these accounts should be treated with some caution given the nature of the sources. Eventually, in 1561, Bayezid and his sons were executed, their deaths arranged through a transaction between the two empires. Suleiman had now outlived 4 of his sons. He had lost Mahmud and Murad in childhood to illness. He had ordered the execution of Mustafa. He had arranged the death of Bayezid and Bayezid's sons. His own grandchildren, he was 66 years old. Selim was the successor. The court organized itself around this reality, with the efficiency of an institution that had managed succession crises before. Suleiman received the news of Bayezid's death with the recorded stillness of a man who has spent decades governing his public expression. The private record suggests something else entirely. The quality of a man who has reached the far end of a particular kind of loss, and who continues not because the losses have become bearable, but because continuing is what the position requires. Sit with that for a moment. He had built an empire. He had written thousands of poems. He had loved one woman completely. He had given everything the system required, and he was sitting in the palace where he had lived his entire adult life, surrounded by officials who needed him to keep making decisions, having just arranged the deaths of his own grandchildren, alone in a way that has no name in any language. He had 3 years left. He spent them governing. He did not stop. He did not retreat. He did not allow the weight of what had happened to pull him from the work that the empire required, because that was what it meant to be Kanuni, the lawgiver, the man who had decided, at 25, that he would spend his life building something durable, and who had spent the next 43 years discovering, one loss at a time, exactly what that decision cost. Chapter 11. Szigetvár, the Last Campaign. In the spring of 1566, the advisers and senior officials of the Ottoman court were watching their sultan with the careful attention of people trying to determine whether what they were seeing was temporary or permanent. Suleiman was 71 years old. His body had been accumulating the costs of 46 years of rule and 13 military campaigns for some time, and by 1566 those costs were visible in ways that court protocol could no longer fully manage. He suffered from gout, a condition that had been troubling him since at least the 1540s, and that by the 1560s had reached a severity that made walking painful and riding. The central physical act of Ottoman military command, an exercise in managed suffering rather than natural authority. He was also carrying the accumulated weight of everything that had happened in those 46 years. Ibrahim, gone. Hafsa, Sultan, gone. Hürrem, gone. Mustafa, gone. Bayezid, gone. The generation of people who had known him before the throne, who had been present for the making of what he became, had almost entirely disappeared. He was governing an empire that was still among the most consequential in the world, and he was doing it with the particular solitude of a man who has outlasted everyone who understood him. The Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, one of the most capable administrators in the empire's history, and by this point managing more of the daily governance than any previous Grand Vizier had been required to manage, reportedly expressed reservations about the Sultan's personal participation in a campaign of this scale, given his condition. Suleiman overruled him. The reasons for the campaign were legitimate. The Habsburg frontier had been restless since the late 1540s, with a series of border violations and skirmishes that the peace arrangements of 1547 and 1562 had been unable to contain. The new Habsburg ruler, Maximilian II, was showing more aggressive intentions on the Hungarian frontier than his predecessor had, and the Ottoman position there required a demonstration of force that would reset the deterrent calculation. There were also internal reasons. A sultan, who had not led a campaign in more than 7 years, was a sultan whose military authority was becoming theoretical rather than demonstrated, and in the Ottoman system, theoretical authority was authority that was beginning to erode. The Janissaries expected the Sultan to campaign. The imperial identity that had sustained Ottoman expansion for a century was built around the figure of the Sultan as the leader of the Holy War, the warrior for the faith, and a sultan who remained in Constantinople while his generals fought his wars, was departing from that identity in ways the traditional elements of the court noticed and discussed. Suleiman needed to campaign. He needed to campaign even at 71, even with gout, even with the knowledge, which those around him understood clearly, that a man of his age and his medical history might not complete what he was beginning. The army assembled in the spring of 1566 was among the largest the empire had put in the field in a generation. Sokolu Mehmed managed the logistical details with his characteristic competence, which was one reason the campaign functioned as well as it did, despite what was developing at its centre. Suleiman left Constantinople on the 1st of May, 1566. He was carried in a litter for much of the journey, his gout making the sustained riding that previous campaigns had required impossible. The litter was enclosed, which meant the army marching north through the Balkans could not easily see their sultan, and the court managed this carefully. He reviewed his troops when the reviews could be arranged in ways that allowed him to appear briefly on horseback, supported in ways that were not obvious to observers at a distance. He received delegations and made decisions and participated in campaign councils with the focused attention that those who attended them described as undiminished. Whatever was happening to his body, his mind was present. They reached the Habsburg frontier in late July. The army moved against the fortress of Szigetvár in early August. Szigetvár, not a great city, it was a relatively small fortress in southern Hungary, set in marshy terrain that gave its defenders natural advantages that its modest walls did not by themselves provide. Its garrison was commanded by a Croatian nobleman named Nikola Subic Zrinski, who was approximately 58 years old, who had spent his career on the military frontier between the Habsburg and Ottoman worlds, and who understood with complete clarity what the arrival of the full Ottoman field army outside his walls meant. It meant he was going to die. The question was not whether Szigetvár would fall. The question was how long the defence could be sustained, and at what cost to the attackers. Zrinski had roughly 2,300 soldiers. According to the estimates most commonly cited by historians of the campaign, against an Ottoman army whose size the contemporary sources describe in numbers that vary widely and should be understood as indicating overwhelming superiority rather than precise counts. Zrinski sent a message to Maximilian asking for relief. Maximilian did not send it. He was calculating, as European rulers had been calculating since the 1520s, that direct military confrontation with the full Ottoman field army was not a contest his forces could win, and that the wiser course was to allow the fortress to absorb the offensive while time and diplomacy worked toward a resolution. It was a reasonable calculation. It left Zrinski with 2,300 men and the marsh and the walls. The siege began in early August and ran for 33 days, a duration that was longer than the Ottoman command had planned for. Zrinski used the terrain and the multiple enclosures of the fortress design with tactical intelligence, making the Ottoman advance through each successive position as expensive as the conditions allowed. The wet terrain complicated the mining operations that would normally have accelerated the fall of a fortress of this size. The garrison fought with the particular intensity of men who know they are going to die and have decided that the manner of their death is the only thing left to choose. Suleiman watched the siege from his tent in the Ottoman camp. He was not watching it the way he had watched his earlier sieges, from the back of a horse with the energy and physical authority of a man in the prime of his military career. He was watching it from a litter, from a campaign tent, through intermediaries who brought him reports and received his decisions. By all accounts, those around him understood he was dying, not only from the illness progressing through his body during the siege, though that was serious, a combination of dysentery and the effects of his long-standing condition that the rigours of the campaign had pushed beyond what his body could sustain, but dying also in the way that a man of 71 who has spent 46 years at the centre of an enormous enterprise dies, with the clarity that comes when the body makes unavoidable what the mind has been able to postpone. He kept making decisions. On the 5th of September, 1566, after 33 days of siege, Suleiman died in his tent. The accounts of his final hours, drawn from multiple contemporary sources, describe a man who had been declining for days, whose physicians were aware that the end was approaching, and who died during the night before the final assault on Szigetvár. The historian John Freely, in his biography of Suleiman, notes that the accounts are consistent in their broad outline, even where they differ in specific details. He died before the fortress fell. What happened next was one of the most remarkable acts of administrative continuity in Ottoman history. Sokolu Mehmed Pasha made an immediate decision. No one would be told. Not the army, not the provincial governors, not the foreign powers watching the campaign, not Selim, the heir. No announcement was made. For approximately 48 hours, and by some accounts longer, the Ottoman army continued to function as though Suleiman were alive. His meals were delivered to his tent. Documents were issued in his name. Officers who needed decisions received them through the normal channels. Responses prepared by Sokolu Mehmed with the Sultan's seal. On the 6th of September, Zrinski made his final decision. He dressed in his best clothes. He assembled the survivors of his garrison, a few hundred men out of the original 2,300. He opened the gates of the inner fortress and led a charge directly into the Ottoman lines. He was killed almost immediately. The fortress fell within hours of his death. Sokolu Mehmed managed the victory with the same controlled efficiency he had applied to everything else, ensuring that the army understood it had achieved its objective while concealing the fact that the Sultan who had ordered the campaign had not lived to see the result. The body was preserved and transported back to Constantinople over the weeks that followed. Arriving at the capital, where the death could finally be announced after Selim had been securely established as the new Sultan. According to Ottoman accounts, Suleiman's heart and internal organs were buried near the site where he died at Szigetvár, in a tomb that was subsequently built there. Hungarian and Turkish researchers working together in recent decades have been attempting to identify the precise location of this burial site. A collaboration that speaks to the way this particular death has continued to matter to both of the nations whose histories it touched. The deception had worked. The empire had absorbed the death of its sultan and continued functioning, which was itself a measure of what Suleiman had built. An institution capable of operating through the death of its founder without fracturing had been built well enough to outlast him. His body reached Constantinople. He was placed in the garden of the Suleymaniye Mosque, beside Hürrem. He had been separated by her for 8 years. He was with her again. Chapter 12. The shadow that lasted 400 years. The empire did not die with Suleiman. This is the first and most important thing to understand about his legacy, because the empires of great rulers have a tendency, in popular historiography, to decline the moment the great ruler disappears, as though the institution were simply an extension of the individual and not a structure capable of continuing beyond any single person who shaped it. The Ottoman Empire in 1566 was not simply Suleiman. It was a system of governance, a military establishment, a legal tradition, a bureaucratic apparatus, a set of commercial arrangements and diplomatic relationships and cultural institutions that had been developing for 2.5 centuries, and that would continue developing for 3.5 centuries more. It would not be finally dissolved until 1922, when the last Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed VI, boarded a British warship in Constantinople and sailed away from a city that was no longer his capital and an empire that had ceased to exist. 356 years after Suleiman's death, the persistence of the empire he led at its peak is itself a measure of what he built, because empires do not simply persist through momentum. They persist because the institutions and the systems and the arrangements that hold them together are strong enough to survive the individual failures and the military reverses and the succession crises and the external pressures that every long-lived state eventually encounters. Suleiman built institutions of unusual durability. The legal framework he established, the canon name, and the broader systematization of Ottoman law that his reign produced, provided the empire with an administrative foundation that remained functional through the reigns of successors who were, by most assessments, considerably less capable than he was. The millet system, the organization of non-Muslim communities into legally recognized groups with defined rights and obligations, created a framework for managing diversity that allowed the empire to govern populations of radically different backgrounds without requiring their cultural assimilation. Communities of Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived and traded and built their lives under a system that was imperfect and unequal in various ways, but that provided, at its best, a degree of legal predictability that made sustained coexistence possible. The building program left a physical infrastructure that served populations for centuries. The bridges and the water systems and the caravanserais that Sinan built were not ornamental. They were practical, and their practicality outlasted the political structures that commissioned them in many cases. His successor, Selim II, has been treated harshly by historiography, largely because the comparison with his father is one no one can survive. Selim was not a military leader in his father's sense. He did not campaign in person. He was not Suleiman. But the empire under Selim continued to function and in some respects to expand. In 1571, the Ottoman fleet took Cyprus from Venice in a campaign that demonstrated the continued effectiveness of the military establishment Suleiman had built. In the same year, at the Battle of Lepanto, the Holy League fleet under Don John of Austria inflicted the first significant Ottoman naval defeat in a generation. Lepanto looms very large in Western historiography and rather smaller in Ottoman historiography, and the discrepancy reflects a genuine difference in strategic consequence. The Holy League did win a major tactical victory, and the Ottoman fleet did suffer serious losses. But within 2 years, the Ottoman fleet had been rebuilt to a size larger than the one destroyed at Lepanto. The Spanish and Venetian alliance that had produced Lepanto dissolved because the two powers could not agree on what to do next. The Ottomans retook the strategic initiative in the Mediterranean within a decade. The historian Andrew Hess, in his study of the Mediterranean after Lepanto, argues that the battle's significance in Western consciousness reflects a desire for a turning point in the Ottoman advance that the actual strategic record does not fully support. Lepanto was a victory that changed less than the celebration it received suggested. The Ottoman Empire's actual period of significant decline came later, in the 17th and 18th centuries, driven by a combination of structural factors that had nothing to do with the absence of any single ruler. The rise of Atlantic trade routes shifted commercial wealth away from the Mediterranean and Levantine routes that had been among the foundations of Ottoman prosperity. The military gap that had given Ottoman armies their decisive advantage in the 16th century narrowed as European states invested in the professional armies and systematic fortification programs that the Ottoman challenge had helped accelerate. The administrative system Suleiman had refined began to calcify in ways that no reformer was able to reverse quickly enough. These were long processes, unfolding over generations. The legal codes Suleiman wrote shaped the governance of populations across 3 continents for generations after his death. Scholars of Islamic law and Ottoman administrative history trace the influence of the Kanun name through the legal systems of the empire's successor states in ways that are still being mapped. A body of law designed to serve actual people in their actual lives did what it was designed to do, outlasting the political structures that commissioned it and the man who insisted it be written. The building program left its most visible mark on the cities where Sinan worked: the Suleymaniye in Constantinople, the Selimiye in Edirne, the bridges and the caravanserais, and the water systems that still bear marks of his engineering across what is now Turkey and the Balkans and the Middle East. These are not simply monuments to imperial ambition. They are the physical record of a ruler who understood that governance was a form of investment in the places you governed, that the empire you built in stone would outlast the empire you built through force. The intellectual tradition that flourished in his court produced consequences that ran through Ottoman life for the century after his death. The scholars and poets and legal thinkers who were educated in the institutions he built carried those educations into careers that shaped the next generation, and the generation after that, in ways the original commission could not have anticipated. The cultural memory of Suleiman has experienced several significant revivals in the centuries since his death, each shaped by the needs of the moment in which the revival occurred. In the 20th century, Turkish nationalism produced a version of Suleiman that emphasized his role as the architect of an Ottoman golden age, whose legal and cultural achievements were the proper inheritance of the modern Turkish state. This version was not entirely wrong, though it tended to smooth over the violence of succession politics and the contradictions between Suleiman's stated principles and the conditions of the empire's more vulnerable populations. In the 21st century, the Turkish television series Muhteşem Yüzyıl, which began airing in 2011 and which was eventually broadcast in more than 40 countries, introduced Suleiman to a global audience that had no previous familiarity with Ottoman history. The series was watched by an estimated 200 million people internationally, producing exactly the kind of sustained interest in the historical figure that makes him one of the more searched names in Ottoman history in recent years. The series was criticized in Turkey for its emphasis on the harem and the personal life at the expense of the military and legal achievements, a criticism that reflected the gap between what a political culture wants its historical figures to represent and what a television drama needs to do to hold an audience. Both versions of Suleiman are present in the historical record. Neither is complete without the other. The man who wrote 3,000 poems and organized the legal system of an empire spanning 3 continents was not 2 different people. He was the same person. And understanding him requires holding both the public achievement and the private life in view simultaneously, without allowing either to collapse into the other. There is a question that serious students of Suleiman's reign eventually arrive at. What did he think it was worth? He had built one of the most powerful empires of his age. He had given it a legal foundation that would last centuries. He had built mosques and hospitals and schools that served populations for generations. He had written poetry of genuine quality. He had loved one woman completely and given her everything within his power to give. He had also ordered the execution of his closest friend. He had watched or arranged the deaths of multiple sons. He had led campaigns in which tens of thousands of people died. He had sustained a system of governance built on structural violence and absolute authority that the Ottoman Sultanate required. His personal diary is not a document of extended reflection on these costs. It is a record of events, decisions, observation, a working document rather than a confessional one. The poetry addresses some of the emotional weight of the losses, without addressing the political decisions that produced them. The Venetian ambassador, Marino Cavalli, writing in 1560, near the end of Suleiman's reign, offered an assessment that historians have returned to repeatedly because it captures something that systematic analysis tends to miss. Cavalli wrote that Suleiman was a man of medium height, with a thin face and a pale complexion, and a dignity of bearing that was the most complete he had encountered in any ruler. He wrote that Suleiman spoke little in public, and that the quality of his silence was more authoritative than most rulers' speech. He wrote that those who served him for decades could not remember him making a decision that he subsequently reversed, and that the consistency of his judgment across more than 4 decades was the quality that his officials most remarked upon. He wrote that the Sultan seemed, to those who observed him closely, to be a man who had decided very early what he believed, and had spent his entire life acting on those beliefs, regardless of the cost. Whether that consistency was wisdom or stubbornness, whether the beliefs it expressed were right or wrong, is a judgment that the historical record invites and does not compel. He decided, he acted, he built, he paid, and in the end, what he left behind was not the campaigns, remarkable as they were. It was not the victories. Though there were many, it was the Suleimania on its hill, the legal codes in the archives, the cities on coasts that had been empty before his reign, the tradition of governance that outlasted him by centuries, and the letters he wrote to a woman in a palace on the Bosphorus from battlefields across 3 continents. Letters that said, underneath all the poetry and the political calculation, something very simple. I am here. I am thinking of you. I will come home. He came home. He is home still. In the garden behind the mosque, on the hill above the water, in the city he governed for 46 years. The Bosphorus moves below him, carrying the traffic of a city of millions who pass through without knowing his name. Toward the sea he spent his reign contesting. The dome floats above the garden in the morning light. He has been there since 1566. He is still there. His name was Suleiman. His own people called him the Lawgiver. History called him the Magnificent. Now you know why both names are true, and why neither one is enough.